Hi, this is William Henderson,
This is B. McGraw,
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So, the Unjerked podcast is affiliated with B. McGraw's website, which is,
the Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
and basically we take an informed look at common internet arguments, and this is part 3 of our episode talking about democracy. Next, we're going to talk about we're going to talk about governmental systems. So there's 4 main ways to categorize this. There's separation of powers between the executive and legislature. There's elite versus public control, separation of executive power into state and government, and then the level of democracy. So when it comes to separation of powers, so there's basically parliamentary systems and there's presidential systems. There's also semi-presidential. And the parliamentary system, the executive basically comes out of the legislature. So usually the prime minister is the leader of the majority party in the parliament and forms a government based out of that. And most of the cabinet ministers, the members of the cabinet, are also members of parliament. So that's one method. The other method is where the executive is totally separate from the legislature, like in the US, and the president is directly elected by them. There's pros and cons to both. It's kind of ambiguous as far as like whether, is one better than the other. So there's MIT Press Direct has an article from Daedalus, which is a journal, Varieties of Presidentialism and Leadership Outcomes. And it basically looks at, what are the different outcomes. It says like there's some research that shows parliamentary systems. It's more common for governments to successfully transition to democracy, but there's other research that shows like, okay, maybe that's not the case. So there's like a slight bias towards like parliamentary might be better in terms of transitioning into a successful democracy, but there's not a lot of pretty clear research as far as this goes. It's a matter of like, okay, so if the executive comes out of the parliament, you're accountable to the members of parliament. If you're directly elected by the people, you're nominally accountable to the people directly. I think parliament is a much more, because there's only a couple hundred members of parliament, it's a lot easier for the members of parliament to mutiny and basically take down a government. So in some ways, I feel like it's a lot easier to rein in, a rogue executive. That's what happened to Boris Johnson. Eventually, his fellow party members in parliament revolted against him. But on the flip side, you're not directly elected by the people. Like none of the UK, none of the members of the UK, none of the prime ministers were chosen by by the people. There was a layer of separation. They were chosen by the people who were elected by the people. So there's no clear answer as far as that goes. And then I'm going to skip down a little to the separation of executive power, and this is where it gets muddled. So there's actually, and I only found the only good map I found about this is from Reddit. So, not a reliable source, but, I'm just going to use it right now, as far as video goes. So head of state and head of government. So what's the difference? Do you know at all?
I was wondering what that difference was. No.
So the head of state is basically like the ceremonial person, and the head of government is basically the bean counter. And so in the U.S.,
look how China says it's complicated in this graph.
So in the U.S., the president is the bean counter. The president makes the executive decisions. The president's also the symbol of America. They have a giant Air Force One and they fly to places and do all the fancy stuff. In the UK, they're separate people. So the head of state is the king, King Charles. He's the symbolic leader. And then the head of government is Rishi Sunak, who's the bean counter, the prime minister. And so this, again, there's no clear research. Some people argue that separating the two is better. Some people say, and this is an argument for having a monarchy, which I don't really believe in, because what you see, the Axis powers, 2 of the 3 countries were monarchies. So I don't fully buy the argument. The argument is like, okay, well, if the head of state, because the head of state is a very emotional thing. It's like, this is our leader. So if you separate that from deciding who, if you separate the two, then you're making voting decisions not based off of emotion, but based off of just policy. So if you're like, who do I, and so the prime ministers, they're actually, from a symbolic perspective, they're not treated as the leader of the country. They're, basically agents that act at the behest of the king. And so, I think the prime minister of the UK does not have the same prestige as the president of the US does. And when you look back at like who was the prime minister of the UK in like the 70s or in the 60s, like it's like nobody really remembers. You remember, Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher and people like that, but it's like, whereas in the US, the presidents, are a lot more memorable, I would say. So, and the other thing that makes this analysis difficult is that very often the 2 roles are separate when you have a parliamentary system, and they're the same person when you have a presidential system. And so it muddies the analysis because you're looking at, basically there's a correlation between separating the state or the head of state and head of government versus the separation of legislature versus executive. And so you have 2 different variables that correlate with each other. And so it makes it hard to analyze the 2 separately. There's also, you don't have to have a monarchy to have separate heads of state and government. Germany has, or Ireland, or, those countries, they have a head of state and they have a head of government. And the head of state is very often elected. So you can have a president who's elected and doesn't have power, and then you have a prime minister who's also elected and also and does have the actual power. And so,
interesting.
Yeah, and so that's another factor that has to be considered.
Do the constitutional monarchy parliaments behave any better when they are constantly at the threat of being dissolved because the king wants to institute a book of common prayer?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully the king doesn't get beheaded if something like that,
I certainly hope so.
So,
my coworker has a scheme for this that's not up here, separating the head of state and head of government. Is that America elects kind of like for our king and royal king and queen of England type situation. We have our nation's dog, and we just elect a dog to do the ceremonial role, and that's the head of state.
That is one of the best ideas I've ever heard in my life.
I kind of want us to do it and just make it completely ceremonial.
So the 2 roles are combined in an absolute monarchy, in an executive presidency, and in one-party states. A lot of times one-party states have like finicky. It's like, oh, well, we have, the chairman of the party, and we have, the head of the Politburo, and, whatever. But usually they're the same person. And then the 2 roles are separated when you have a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy usually, or you have a constitutional republic that separates the president and the prime minister.
Here's a question. So in America, they always mention that the president will de facto be the head of their party.
Right.
Has that always been the case?
I think so.
Seems like
it. So that's separation of power, and then elite versus public control. So this is really more just like, what's it called? What's it called when something's like not de facto? It's like on paper, but not in reality. Forgot what the terminology is, but basically, like this in practice, this doesn't really matter as much as you would think. So there's oligarchies, and there's republics. So an oligarchy is where, it is spelled out like the people in charge are a small group of people. Like, the rule of the country is a private matter for the elite. And then a republic, by definition, is where the rule of the country is a matter of the public at large. this gets muddled. The reason why this doesn't matter as much as it sounds is because a lot of times, a lot of oligarchies in reality are functionally democracies, and a lot of countries that call themselves republics are dictatorships. In fact, if a country calls itself the Democratic Republic of something, you can be pretty sure it's not a democracy and that it's not a republic. Democratic Republic of North Korea, for example. So a monarchy, by definition, the royal family is basically treated as if they were chosen by God to rule the country. And most monarchies now functionally are democracies because the monarch gives parliament power to rule the country. But technically, according to the laws, like the King of England or King of the UK, King Charles still has, the ability to do all sorts of things that he just doesn't do because it just wouldn't be tolerated if he tried to do those things. But technically, the UK is a rule under a monarch. One-party states where rule is a matter of the state of the party, a private matter of the party, a military junta where rule is a private matter of this military council, a kleptocracy where basically the rich people rule the country. And then in republics, you have presidential and parliamentary republics. So you either have an executive presidency and a legislature, or you have a parliament. So, that's another way of looking at it. And then finally, there's like the level of democracy that exists. So basically what you have here, the most democratic countries right now, there's Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and then like Western and Northern Europe, basically, and Greece, interestingly enough. And then you have super undemocratic countries, which are mostly Middle East, Northern Africa, Central Asia, China, Burma, etc. Few things to note. So Latin America actually has somewhat decent democracy. Not super democratic, but pretty good. Southern Africa is actually more democratic than the rest of Africa, even though in other measures they might have other issues, but in terms of democracy, they're actually more democratic than the rest of the continent. India is a democracy. Indonesia is a democracy. So there's some interesting nuances there. And there's also the forms of government, which we already talked about. There's presidential republics, parliamentary republics, monarchies, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no hard and fast rules. I think parliamentary systems, whether it's a Republican parliament or a monarchy with a parliament, they tend to be democracies. So when you look at the red in this map that no one else can see right now, so the red color is constitutional monarchies, and these are all democracies basically: Canada, UK, Spain, etc. You also have parliamentary republics where you have a parliament, and then the head of state is a president who's like elected by the people or something like that. So it's like a constant. Go ahead.
Japan's still a monarch?
Yeah, they have an emperor.
That's right. The emperor is still a thing.
Yeah. So parliamentary republics also tend to be democracies. And then on the flip side, there's the obvious what is not democratic. So absolute monarchies are not democracies. So think the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Oman, etc. And then the same with like absolute monarchies, semi-constitutional monarchies, one-party states, China, Vietnam, where there's a constitutional provision basically saying that the Communist Party has special power. Because technically the Chinese Congress, whatever it's called, technically does have other parties. It's not just the Communist Party. There's other parties. But the reality is the other parties are controlled basically in terms of the level of influence they're allowed to have. Also, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is not China's army. It is the Communist Chinese Party's army. It is specifically meant to be the party's army. And so you have basically different provisions that essentially ensure one-party states are dictatorships as a general rule. Not even a general rule; they're always dictatorships.
Yeah.
And then military juntas are also dictatorships.
Is it junta or junta?
Junta.
Junta. Would you call an anarcho-syndicalist syndicalist commune where everyone takes turns ruling the country every week a democracy or a dictatorship?
Well, I think the trouble with that is I think who rules the country should be decided on whether or not someone gets a sword from someone who comes out of a lake. I think that's the way you decide, who runs a country. So I would have to say.
So you're more for one sword, one vote.
Yeah,
type
basically.
Of a guy.
Yeah.
Okay.
When it comes to presidential systems, this is when it gets murky, because the U.S. is a democracy. It's a presidential system. But a lot of Central Asian countries, the stands, or Iran, for example. Iran has a supreme leader, so that's a different thing. But a lot of those countries are functionally, autocracies. A lot of countries in certain parts of Africa are presidential systems, and they are, more or less dictatorships. So it gets a little murky. And then you have a semi-presidential system, which is in yellow. And, there as well, Russia is a semi-presidential system. I think we can all agree Russia is not a democracy. But on the other hand, France is also a semi-presidential system, and they are a democracy. And so it seems like presidential systems are kind of straddle on both sides. Whereas parliamentary systems generally tend to be more on the democracy side. So I thought that was interesting. Finally, how voting happens. So there's actually a large number of electoral systems. It's very interesting. So basically, there's three categories. There's majoritarian systems, single winner districts, majoritarian multi-winner, and then proportional systems. So essentially, this means if there's a district, like a congressional district, how do people get chosen? So majoritarian single winner means there's one candidate who gets chosen for the district, and it's whoever, is the majority, whether it's plurality or whatever. Majoritarian multi-winner is where you have multiple members from that district, but they all go to the majority winner. And then a proportional system is where you have multiple members in a district, but they're divided by proportion of who wins the vote. So this is something that nobody really talks about, but it's actually very important.
That's why we're here.
Yeah. So I think the issue with majoritarian single winner, first past the post, which is the way most of the US does it, is in that category. There's also a 2-round runoff, instant runoff, which is a type of ranked voting. But usually it's first past the post. And first past the post is the ultimate spoiler effect system. You can do gerrymandering. You'll have spoiler effect because you don't want your vote to spoil, the person who's more likely to win that you also like. So I think it's a poor system overall. When you move on to, then you move on to majoritarian multi-winner. So you can have a system called block voting where you cast, let's say there's 5 spots in a district, so you can cast 5 votes. Or you'll have party block voting where you vote for the party, and then the party that won gets all the seats for that district. And then moving on to proportional, basically you can have a party-less proportional system. So the candidate, so the results are sorted out into who gets a seat. So basically, let's say 70% go for one party, then 70% of the seats go to that party. And then the party will have a list, a party list. They're like, hey, here are the 10 candidates we want, ranked from 1 to 10. And then let's say they get 70% of the vote, then their first 7 candidates will get a seat in that district. And then there's a proportional system called single transferable vote, which is, I believe, a form of ranked choice voting. And then you have mixed systems that do both majoritarian and proportional. So the research seems to indicate, this think tank, what's the name of this think tank? Economics for Inclusive Prosperity. So they looked at the different systems, and essentially the big benefit to proportional systems is that they're harder to gerrymander, and they're more representative of voting choices automatically. Because if let's say 60% of the vote goes to the purple party, and 60% of the seats in that district go to the purple party, I mean, that's automatically like a pretty good representation of what people want, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So there's benefits there. It's hard to gerrymander. Let's say there's 10 seats for the state of Colorado. I mean, you can't gerrymander it because everything's proportional. If 70% of the vote goes to the purple party, then 7 of the 10 seats will go to that party. You can't gerrymander it. The only in this, you know, people aren't going to move state boundaries, for example. So I'm a fan of proportional. We don't do proportional in the U.S. for the most part.
Yeah, I could. That seems about right. I think what holds people back is there's some folksy notion that, you know, whoever you're sending to Congress to represent your district is someone that you'll see at church and you're like, hey, I saw you voted wrong on that one bill. But
Yeah.
I don't think that happens.
Well, so the number of so the U.S. Congress stopped increasing in size a while ago because of some law, and so the actual number of people that each congressman represents has been, you know, increasing dramatically. So maybe we could do it by congressional. Maybe we could increase the size of Congress, but say like, hey, now each congressional district gets like 5 Congress people voted proportionally. Proportional systems are kind of inherently outside of the sort of geographic way of doing things, because it's like, hey, in this district,
that's the folksy notion, is that the literal person you vote for is actually from that district.
Yeah, so I think if we said like, hey, proportional but no districts at all, it's just like the entire United States, and we'll do proportion based off of that, then I think you can definitely have a position where it's like, hey, you know, the party list, they chose only people from California or whatever. So like, let's say the yellow party gets 40% of the vote, and they're like, hey, here are our, you know, I don't know, 80, I don't know what the numbers are, but let's say here are the 80 members of Congress we'll send to Congress, and they pull out the list that they had from before that they showed everyone, and like, you know, 70% of the people are from California. So that's a thing that could happen. I think if you combine the two, if you still had districts but did proportional within the districts, you can kind of get halfway there, I think. And the final thing we'll talk about is different voting systems. So we talked about electoral systems in terms of districts and proportional versus majoritarian. Now we're going to talk about how does the actual vote happen. And this is very relevant to the spoiler effect. So the spoiler effect is a big issue. Tactical voting is another issue, where you vote for someone besides who you want because you think it'll have some desired outcome. And then, you know, just the level of complexity is another issue. Like, how hard is it to run this system of voting? So right now in the US, most states do plurality voting. So you vote for one person and that's it. So let's say when you count the tally, it's one vote for that one person. Everyone else gets 0 vote for your ballot. The problem with this is there's a very strong spoiler effect. So you don't want to vote for third parties because it's going to reduce votes towards your second favorite candidate, who's more likely to win. So basically, plurality voting heavily favors a 2-party system.
Yeah,
I mean that's why we have a 2-party system. And then it increases majority cohesion, so it increases the chance of people being, you know, of members of Congress being loyal to their party rather than to their own belief system. And there's a thing called Condorcet efficiency. I don't know if I spelled that right, but basically they're like, hey, if we ran, if there's 10 candidates, we did head to head of like every single combination possible, and then use that as a method of saying like, okay, who do people actually want, if that makes sense. So let's say like there's
Condorcet what?
Efficiency. So this is like the
What
theoretical, it's the theoretical like most best representation of like who the people want. So let's say there's 10 people in the primary, and you're like, okay, do you want candidate 1 or candidate 2? Do you want candidate 1 or candidate 3? And then you do like every single possible combination, right? So that'd be like 100 different combinations. And then you can basically look at those and say, okay, this is what people actually want based off all the different preferences they listed. So Condorcet efficiency is a proxy word for like what do people actually want. It's a fancy way of saying that.
That's a new word of the day.
Yeah. So
for me at least.
So plurality voting, it's actually very weak as far as that goes. The other is ranked choice voting. So this is gaining more popularity. I think Maine and Alaska have ranked choice voting now.
Yeah, I like the idea of it. I keep hearing from people when I say, "Oh, I wish we had ranked choice voting," that everyone goes, "Oh, that sounds really complicated to implement." Do tell me if there's any research on if it's better and how easy is it to implement.
So the implementation is actually a little tricky. So that is true. Because
really?
You need new ballots. You need people might be confused, like because basically ranked choice, it's like you have a ballot and you're like, this is my number 1, my number 2, my number 3, my number 4, etc. And then if your number 1 doesn't get picked because they're polling too low, then your number 2 is who you vote for, and so they automatically do that for you. And the reason this is good is because it removes the spoiler effect. Because you're like, well, I'll put Ralph Nader as number 1, and I'm not afraid this will hurt Al Gore, because if Ralph Nader doesn't get enough votes, then my vote is, my ballot's going to go to Al Gore because I put him as number 2. So it fixes spoiler effect. It also reduces majority cohesion, so there's less party line voting. It also reduces strategic voting, so there's a lot of benefits. It is like, you will need new ballots. You'll need poll workers who understand the new system. People will need to be educated. It might be easier to have invalidated ballots. Like, what if someone had like one, this is number 1, this is number 2, and then for number 3, I'll write down like 2 different people as number 3. I don't think you're allowed to do that. You have one. It has to be one number 1, one number 2, one number 3, one number 4, etc. So there might be situations where ballots are invalidated because someone writes number 1 for like 3 different people or something. So
would
it is a little confusing.
Would you do it with like a multiple choice thing, or like who's your number 1, yeah. Who's your number 2? Because otherwise, like, I mean, I feel like most people now, like if you're not mail-in balloting, you're going to be doing it electronically, so that doesn't seem that difficult. But say it's like a mail-in ballot or something that you're actually writing, like you could get to a situation where like, I don't know, this dude's handwriting is awful. Is that a 1 or a 2?
I think I read that like mail-in, or like not mail-in, but I heard that paper voting is like way better in terms of security.
Oh, here's how you do it. You make the instructions to only use Roman numerals, so handwriting isn't a thing.
So that's ranked choice. I personally like ranked choice. Approval voting. Yeah. So approval voting is another system. So basically, with plurality, you have one person who's your 1 vote, and then everyone else is 0. With approval voting, you can basically do a 1 or a 0 for every single person on the ballot. So basically, like, do you like this person? Yes or no. So if there's 5 different people, you can be like, I like this guy. I also like this guy. I don't like this guy. And I like this guy also. So you're basically, you're not ranking people. It's basically binary. You're saying 1 or 0 for multiple people. And the idea is it reduces strategic or tactical voting. Those are the same thing. It reduces tactical voting a little bit. It's simple. It's a lot simpler than ranked choice. It doesn't do as good of a job with the spoiler effect. But it's a lot easier to implement with our current voting infrastructure. And then score voting is like basically an upgraded version of approval voting, where instead of giving each person a 1 or a 0, you're basically ranking from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. But it doesn't have to be ranked. Like, you can have multiple people with the same number. So with ranked choice, it's like, this is my first, second, third, fourth, fifth. With score voting, you can say, I give this person 5 out of 5. I give this person 3 out of 5. I also give this person 5 out of 5. And so basically for each person, you're giving them a score of 1 to 5, out of 1 to 5, independent.
I've never heard of that one. Yeah, those approval and score voting's new to me. Has anyone used that?
I think so.
Who?
I think so. I'm not sure, but apparently there's a few places where it's used. And it's a little better with spoiler effect compared to approval voting, and it's simpler than ranked voting. But it probably does not deal with spoiler effect as well as ranked voting. Star voting
Are you gonna get that situation where I think people complain about like guys trashing women's movies on Rotten Tomatoes or whatever. They keep giving my favorite movie 1 star just because it's not for them. Actually, I think that might be a good thing because that would disincentivize very offensive candidates.
So finally, you have star voting. So this one has never been tried to my knowledge, but apparently some like mathematicians or some fancy people think it's like a super special way of voting. But basically,
I don't think it's going to work if it involves a proof.
So star means score, then automatic runoff. So you start with score voting. So you start with giving everyone a 1 to 5 rating. You can give the same rating to more than one person. And then after that, you do a runoff. So the top 2 people get picked, and then for each ballot, you say like who got the higher score among the top 2. Does that make sense? So it's like, okay, so basically you take so for score voting, you have a 1 to 5 score you give to each person, and then once all the ballots are counted, each candidate gets an average score from all the votes they got, right? So like 3.6 out of 5, 1.4 out of 5, etc. With star voting, you use that to be like, okay, who's the top 2 out of like however many people? And then it's like, okay, let's, for each ballot, which of those 2 people got a higher score? On this ballot, this guy got 3 out of 5, this guy got 4 out of 5, so the second guy won this ballot. For this ballot, it was this. For this ballot, it was this. So you look at all the ballots again, and you say, who was the higher of the 2 for each of those ballots? So it combines score voting. Basically, it's score voting followed by a runoff system. And I'm not really sure what the rationale is, but apparently it's somehow better than like the score voting system. I guess the overall point I'm trying to make here is like there's a lot of different innovations that can happen within a democracy, especially within the system of elections. For the most part in the U.S., I think the good thing about the U.S. is that that voting is controlled by the state governments. It's controlled by the state Secretary of State of each state. And so there's actually room for experimentation. And so you're seeing that in Alaska, you're seeing that in Maine, where they have ranked voting. And I don't know if it's all their elections, but at least some of their elections, they have ranked voting. And there's, not just ranked voting, there's approval voting, there's score voting, there's star voting. There's all sorts of voting, and what's to say plurality? Why is plurality what we do? It's because that's what we started out with, but we have no idea if it's the best system. It probably isn't the best system. So I don't think it is
from what we're seeing.
Yeah, so I'm saying we need to think about these things more, because like the voting system is one of the most important ones, because I just think the spoiler effect is so destructive because only like 30% of eligible voters vote in primaries. It's like the 15% most extreme Democrats and the 15% most extreme Republicans vote in primaries, and like the middle 70% don't vote in primaries at all. So there's a 70% of people who don't have a decision in terms of who runs for the general election.
Also when it's a really crowded field, like you end up with some like really boring person usually that's just the least offensive person in the primary, or it does push to the extremes.
The last thing I want to mention. So the Electoral College.
Oh, really quick on voting systems.
Sure.
In your research, what was the best tiebreaker method that you found? Do any countries use arm wrestling in case of an election goes to a tie?
Um, I don't think so.
Do
Yeah,
any have like a shoot off?
maybe they used to, but I don't think anymore. Um, when it comes to the Electoral College, so the U.S. is the only system that has anything like an Electoral College. So we actually don't vote for president. We vote for an elector, and none of us will probably know who our elector is. But when we write on the ballot, I'm voting for this person or that person. What you're really saying is I'm going to vote for the person who pledged to vote for that person. This is a very troublesome system for a lot of reasons. So one is technically electors. You have had faithless electors who've switched their vote. Usually, it's not enough to move the needle, but like, what if it is? That's problematic. You also have, basically, it's a majoritarian. Like I mentioned before, it's a majoritarian per state, and so if Colorado is like 51% Republican, then all of their votes will go to the Republican. It's like, well,
Yeah.
what about the 49% of the people who voted for the other party? So if you have proportional, some states, 2 states, I think, have proportional electors, but still, if you have 7 electors, the percentage increments are still pretty large. So it's like, okay, like let's say it's 10 electors, like you're basically, even if you have proportional, it's like, well, 10%, 20%, 30%. Like, you can't do 24%, 26%, etc. And the reason why we have an electoral college is 2 reasons. So one is slave states wanted their slaves to count towards the population of voters, and we ended up having the 3/5 compromise because the non-slave states did not want slaves to count towards the final vote because it would give more power to the slave states without actually giving voting rights to the slaves. But the problem with, like, even with the 3/5 compromise, it's like, okay, well then how do the slaves are not going to vote, and so the slave states weren't going to let slaves vote. So it's like, well, how do you represent that slave population in terms of who gets chosen for president without having the slaves vote? And so the electoral college was a compromise where they're like, hey, based off the population, we're going to vote for this number of electors. And then the other is that small states, because each state would have a minimum of 3 electors because you had 2 senators and 1 representative, right? So it would automatically give more power to small states. So the electoral college, as it stands now, is vulnerable to bad faith, faithless electors switching their vote. It's vulnerable to non-majoritarian, or like it's vulnerable to very slim majorities in states, meaning all votes go to that person. It's just over, and it gives disproportionate power to small states. It just is way easier to just be like, okay, we'll just look at the number of votes that people vote for. If there's like 100 million people who vote for president, let's just look at who wins the most out of 100 million votes for the entire country. It's not that hard to do. I think the electoral college is completely anachronistic at this point. It also was from an era where people couldn't communicate easily. So you had to like ride horses to the Capitol to like cast your vote. But like as it stands now, there is no reason to have an electoral college at all. I think it is totally unnecessary. So that's kind of our episode. If I had to describe what are my opinions about what policies should be implemented, we talked about a lot of things. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I think, to sum it up, I think we should not have an electoral college. I think we should have ranked voting of some kind for most elections, and I also think we need to do proportional systems instead of majoritarian systems for congressional districts. And I think that would fix probably at least half of the problems we have right now.
Would all states, if we were to choose ranked choice voting, would all states have to adopt it at the same time, or could one by one start adopting it?
You could do one by one. You know, like voting is controlled by the states, so that's why it's tough to, you know, you can't just pass a, you know, federal law about this. So I think it's important for people who care about this. There's all sorts of nonprofits that advocate for this, but at the state level, different people, advocates should push for ranked voting at the state level. You are seeing it already in some places, like in Maine and Alaska. So I really think that's the direction things should go. So, all right.
Yeah, I feel like I had something else I wanted to bring up, but I can't quite remember it. Oh, there was one thing I wanted to bring up.
Sure.
And this is kind of... So one of the things that people criticize about, say, oh, you say you're a democracy, but you're not a democracy, is you jail your opposition, you know, Russia and Navalny situation. So a lot of people are very concerned about that and Trump with all of the trials going on. But on the other hand, does that mean that all politicians should just be completely invulnerable to their actions if, you know, they are guilty of something? What's the right way of balancing holding politicians accountable without allowing authoritarians to abuse that power?
Well, the solution is an independent judiciary. So I think most people don't really know a lot about the judicial system. A lot of people will say, like, you know, this party convicted this person, but like most trials involve a jury that's agreed upon by both the prosecuting team and the defense team and the judge. So most trials are chosen by people, you know, everyday people. And that's a constitutional protection enshrined in the Constitution, that we have a right to a jury trial. Most countries, maybe not most countries, but like a ton of countries don't have juries. So I think that's one, you know, we have a judicial system that's independent from the other branches of government. We have, at the federal level, judges are appointed by politicians and then are given lifetime appointments. At the state level, very often they're elected by the people. You know, there's the system of juries. And so I think it's important to educate people on the independent judicial system and state judicial systems. State judiciaries are also independent from the federal government as well. So that's something else to consider. I mean, the federal judiciary can turn down decisions made by the state judiciary, but still they're separate entities. Whereas in Russia, you know, the Russian judiciary is not independent of the executive. It just isn't. Like, you know, when was the last time the Russian judiciary, you know, turned down a policy decision that Putin had? It doesn't happen.
Yeah,
it just doesn't happen.
I think there's a lot of debate over, I think, Israel's like trying to hold on to an independent judiciary right now. That was in the news this last year, if I remember right.
But like
pre-Gaza war.
But in our system, like, the judiciary constantly overturns decisions made by the other branches all the time.
Oh, all the time.
That's what, you know, the Supreme Court routinely says no to decisions made by Congress, and the same with executive decisions. The student loan thing was overturned by the judicial system. You know, Biden wanted to push for student loan forgiveness, and the judiciary said, you don't have that authority under that statute. And so
I think Trump had a lot of immigration executive orders that got really quickly turned around.
Yeah, and a lot of the judges in the system were appointed by both parties. They were appointed. Many of them were appointed under Democrats and many under Republicans. So I have a fair amount of faith in our judiciary. That's kind of where I'll put it. And like I said, in Russia, like, the judiciary is not independent in Russia. It just isn't. It is a tool for the executive. So that's what I would say. Anyways, well, that's it for our podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Yep, see it.